I woke up to an odd smell that day. It wasn't a typical morning scent of coffee or breakfast. It was something more specific, something like fresh bacon and eggs cooking. I slowly opened my eyes, confused. The sun hadn't even fully risen yet, so why was I already smelling food? I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, and heard no noise, no sizzling in the kitchen, no clinking of pots and pans, nothing. I listened for a while, but there was only silence. At first, I thought maybe I had dreamt it, but as I lay there in bed, the smell didn't go away. It lingered in the air, almost too real to be a figment of my imagination. I forced myself out of bed, still trying to shake off the odd feeling in my chest. My mind raced with all sorts of explanations. Maybe my roommate was up early? But then I remembered, I live alone. The house was empty. I stood up and walked down the hallway to the kitchen, where the smell seemed to be the strongest. As I walked through the living room, I felt this strange chill in the air. The house felt colder than usual, almost like it wasn't even my home anymore. The weirdest part was that I hadn't heard anything, no one coming in, no footsteps, no doors opening, just the overwhelming smell of food. I reached the kitchen door, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The air was thick with the scent of bacon frying, eggs sizzling in a pan, and the unmistakable smell of freshly brewed coffee. But as I pushed the door open, there was nothing, just an empty kitchen, as silent as the rest of the house. No one was there. The stove was turned off, the counter was spotless, and nothing was cooking. My heart began to race. How could this be? The smell was so vivid, so real, it had to be coming from somewhere. I turned around, checking the hallway behind me, half expecting someone to pop out from a hidden corner or some prankster to jump out. But there was nothing. It was just me and this strange, eerie smell. The kitchen was always where I felt the most at ease, yet now it felt completely wrong. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty counters, the untouched stovetop, and the silence that weighed heavily in the room. The smell was still there, but it wasn't coming from anything. I was starting to question my sanity. I grabbed my phone and dialed my best friend. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, to make sense of what was going on. The phone rang and rang before finally going to voicemail. Great, I muttered to myself. I hung up and thought about calling again, but something told me that wouldn't make a difference. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked around the kitchen one last time, then slowly walked toward the front door. I needed fresh air. I needed to get out of the house, even if just for a minute, to clear my head. The moment I stepped outside, the smell of food was gone. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, like it was never there in the first place. I took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling my lungs, trying to shake the unease that was still gnawing at me. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined the whole thing? The silence around me was deafening, and I realized I hadn't even noticed how quiet everything had been inside. Not a sound, not a person, just me standing there questioning what I had experienced. I walked around the block for a while, hoping the unsettling feeling would fade. I couldn't explain it, couldn't even understand it. It was like my senses had betrayed me. The smell was so real, yet the kitchen had been empty. My mind kept replaying the events in fast forward, but there was nothing that made sense. I couldn't put the pieces together, and that bothered me. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. When I returned home, I hesitated before stepping back inside. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I was hoping that everything would just go back to normal. The house was still empty, still silent. I walked into the kitchen again just to make sure. Everything was the same, quiet, clean, untouched. I stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the empty stove. Was I going crazy? Or was there something in this house I wasn't seeing? My skin crawled as I began to feel like I was being watched. I sat down at the kitchen table, trying to shake the feeling of unease. I told myself it was just a fluke, some weird dreamlike experience, maybe. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The smell had been too real. I couldn't ignore it. My eyes darted to the window, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move outside, a shadow passing by, or maybe just the reflection of the trees in the window. I shook my head and stood up, quickly walking away from the kitchen. My thoughts were racing. Was someone in the house? Had someone been here, cooking food and leaving without a trace? I decided to check the rest of the house, walking through every room, opening every closet and drawer. I wanted to prove to myself that everything was fine, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of intrusion. No clues. Just an empty house, the same as it had always been. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Something that shouldn't have been. I returned to the kitchen, sitting down once again, trying to steady my breath. The house still felt cold, despite the warmth of the sun coming through the windows. After hours of second-guessing myself and pacing the house, I finally decided to just go to bed early. I didn't want to deal with it anymore. I turned off the lights, got under the covers, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. My mind kept drifting back to the kitchen, to that smell. It lingered in my senses, even though it was long gone. I couldn't shake it. And even now, as I write this, I still can't explain it. The house was empty. There was no one there. But I know what I smelled. I know what I felt. And to this day, I have no idea what was going on in that house. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe something else was there with me that morning. I don't know, but I'll never forget it. I was sitting in my living room, mindlessly flipping through channels on TV. It was late at night, just past midnight, and the house was eerily quiet. I lived alone, so the silence was normal, but tonight it felt different. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding on to something unspoken. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I heard it, a soft melody, faint at first, like a song playing in the distance. It was beautiful, almost nostalgic, like something I had heard before, but I couldn't quite place it. The odd part? It was coming from the basement. I froze. I didn't have any music playing. I don't even own a record player. And yet, the tune continued, sweet and melodic, filling the air with an unnatural calm. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just my imagination, but the more I listened, the more real it became. My heart rate picked up, a knot forming in my stomach. I knew I had to check it out, but I didn't want to. The basement was the last place I wanted to go. But the curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me towards the stairs. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my movements as quiet as possible, though the floorboards creaked under my feet. I couldn't understand what was going on. I hadn't heard anything like this before. The melody wasn't loud enough to be from a stereo or TV. It had to be something else. As I approached the basement door, the music seemed to get a little louder, as if it was calling me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the neighbor was playing music through the walls, or maybe it was just the house settling, making odd sounds. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. The basement was always a bit unsettling. It wasn't the nicest part of the house, with its cold concrete floor and dim lighting. I hadn't been down there in weeks, maybe even longer. The door creaked as I opened it, and the music seemed to become clearer, more distinct. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming from downstairs. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was so beautiful, yet there was something undeniably wrong about it. I stepped onto the first stair and heard the familiar creak beneath my feet. Slowly, cautiously, I descended, my hand gripping the railing for support. The further I went down, the more oppressive the air felt. It was thick, musty, and cold, and the music seemed to swirl around me, a comforting yet eerie tune that sent a shiver down my spine. When I reached the bottom, the sound was at its peak, as if I was standing right next to the source. But when I looked around, there was nothing. The room was empty. The faint light from the lone bulb hanging from the ceiling illuminated the bare walls, the cold concrete floor, and an old, dusty gramophone sitting in the corner. I stared at it for a moment, my heart pounding. The melody had been coming from the gramophone, but it was turned off. There was no way it could have been playing. I took a step closer, my curiosity growing. It was an old model, the kind you only see in antique shops. The needle was still in place, pointing harmlessly toward the empty record player. I felt a wave of confusion and unease wash over me. How could this be? I hadn't even seen this gramophone in the house before. It wasn't mine. I reached down, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold metal of the gramophone. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just an old, malfunctioning device that had somehow turned on by itself. But as I examined it more closely, I realized something was even stranger. There was dust on the gramophone, but the surface where the needle rested was spotless, as if someone had recently used it. My stomach turned. Suddenly, the music stopped. Everything went silent. The abruptness of it was jarring. I stood there, motionless, waiting for the sound to return, but it didn't. The silence felt suffocating. I looked around the basement, half expecting something or someone to be hiding in the shadows. But the room was as empty and quiet as it had been before. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the gramophone, and quickly made my way back up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, my heart still racing. I couldn't explain what had just happened. Who had been in the house? Why was the gramophone playing a song I'd never heard before, a song that felt so strangely familiar? I sat back down on the couch, feeling completely unsettled. I knew I wouldn't be going back into that basement anytime soon. That night, I locked every door in the house and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that soft melody echoing in my mind. It wasn't the kind of sound you forget easily. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was playing that song from the basement. But every now and then, when the house is quiet, I swear I can still hear it, faintly, softly, like it's waiting for me to return. It was a cold night when it happened. I had just finished reading my favorite bedtime story, the one my mom always read to me before I went to sleep. The house was quiet, with the only sound being the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I felt safe in my room, tucked under the covers, with the dim night light casting shadows on the walls. But then, around 3 a.m., something woke me up. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Maybe it was a noise, or maybe it was just the feeling that something wasn't right. I opened my eyes, staring into the darkness, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the hallway. It wasn't anything that made sense. It wasn't like the shadows I was used to seeing in the dark. This was something more. The figure stood motionless, just beyond the edge of my bedroom door. I couldn't see any details at first, only a tall, dark shape, almost like a person but not quite. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. It was just there, staring into my room. My heart started to race, and I pulled the covers up tighter, hoping whatever it was would disappear. But it didn't. The figure stood there for what felt like forever, just waiting. I tried to call out for my parents, but my voice wouldn't come. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on me. I felt trapped, like I couldn't breathe. My body wouldn't move. I don't know how long I stared at it, but the figure didn't change, it stayed still, its form just barely visible in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't do anything. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I closed my eyes tightly and tried to pretend it wasn't real. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. But I still felt it, like it was still there watching me. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. I hadn't gotten any real sleep. My eyes felt heavy, and my head was foggy. I tried to shake off the fear from the night before, but something still felt off. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, or if what I saw was real. I didn't want to go out of my room, but eventually I had to. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed something strange. There, just beyond my bedroom door, was something on the floor. It was hard to see at first, but as I stepped closer, I saw it, muddy footprints. The prints were large, with deep indentations, like someone had walked through wet dirt, leaving behind a trail of wet mud. I was confused, but I knew those footprints hadn't been there when I went to bed the night before. I followed the trail, feeling my heart race with each step. The muddy footprints led straight to the front door. But when I reached the door, I froze. There was no sign of how the person, or whatever it was, had entered the house. The door was locked, the windows were shut tight. My mind started to race. How could this be? Who could have walked through the house, leaving these muddy prints behind? I ran to my parents' room to tell them, but they were still asleep, completely unaware of anything strange. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But the footprints didn't lie. They were real, and they had no explanation. As the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the hallway, about the muddy footprints that had appeared overnight. No one else saw it, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew something was wrong. I didn't feel safe anymore in my own house. Later that afternoon, I went back to my room to grab something. When I passed the hallway again, I noticed something even stranger. The muddy footprints were gone. It was as if they had never existed at all. The floor was completely clean, no trace of dirt or mud to be found. I stood there, my mind racing, trying to figure out how this could be possible. Could I have imagined the whole thing? But I knew I hadn't. The fear, the tension, the feeling of something watching me, it was all real. I didn't want to be in that house anymore. I felt like something was waiting for me, something I couldn't explain. I never saw the figure again, and the footprints never reappeared. But ever since that night, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. It's like the house has changed somehow, like it's not the same anymore. I don't know what happened that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. But whatever it was, it's still with me, lurking just beyond the edges of my memory.